Okay, we left off with the sort of culminated with the farmers' alliances. I wanted to be thinking about how this really is a response of common people to circumstances they feel are unfair. Um, this is their challenge to what the robber barons, the captains of industry, are doing. They are going to really challenge the entire system, but really starting on a local level and questioning on some levels who the true Americans are. Right? Is it someone that sits in an office, doesn't sweat it all and work with their hands and make millions upon millions of dollars, or is it somebody who's working in the dirt, like literally attached to the soil, building the nation, feeding the nation? So for some, they're going to answer the second one. Right? We go all the way back to Jefferson and looking at how oftentimes Americans have defined the most American of all as those that work in the land. Remember, Jefferson has this idea about the truest Americans being small farmers. He felt like those folks were most invested in the society, tied to the land in a certain way, independent. Right? There's this notion of the kind of independent yeoman farmer, as they discussed as being central to a democracy because they weren't working in a factory for someone else and therefore weren't tied to someone else, both economically and perhaps politically. So you might even trace this back to, the colonial era. Now, of course, in that era, there was, going to be ultimately millions of unpaid people working in the land as well. So that's always kind of maybe a hypocritical part of that idea about work and labor and its significance. But you get the point. This notion that perhaps those that are actually sweating and toiling might have more, or should be gaining more from the society than those that don't. Yet others might look at it quite differently, right? These folks are utilizing their talents, creating for the society, moving the whole nation in a direction that it had not gone before. So there really is kind of an internal debate happening. You can hear this debate and see this debate sort of flex in the spirit of 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. And it's going to become a political issue. It's going to become a political issue. But big picture, folks are questioning their society. They're questioning both the positives and the negatives of their society and trying to make certain changes. So I talked about the Southern Farmers Alliance. A Colored Farmers Alliance will also form in response, particularly when they find themselves excluded from the Southern Farmers Alliance, even though most of them live in the South. So you also get a Northern Farmers Alliance as well. So there's still kind of regional identities tied to this movement. I mentioned the sort of the Grange, right? This is going to become known as the Granger movement, as folks name the movement after really the headquarters of these farmers' alliances, which were called the Grange, where they had a lot of the meetings and discussed a lot of these ideas and really begin political discussions, economic discussions on a wide scale, but also everyday practical discussions, things like how are we going to get our crops to market, at a price that's more fair for small farmers. But eventually they say, well, we need to change the whole system. But eventually they're going to get it to the point where they say, you know what, we don't just need to change a few businessmen. We need to change the entire system, perhaps challenge the entire system, maybe even of capitalism itself. So this is going to be interesting how these movements may take off. The earlier Granger movement had sought to pass laws that would improve their positions, and improve their conditions generally. They wanted to do things like limit the salaries of public officials. You can think even about today how we sort of should public officials make unlimited amounts, or should there be some limit on that for the public good? They're going to raise these types of arguments even as early as the 1890s, especially when the salaries of some prominent people may begin to explode. They wanted to provide public schools for students at little or no cost, things like books, right, that they feel are going to be essential for the next generation of people coming up. Think American Dream, right? Even if they're farmers, even if they're working hard every day and not seeing much profit, you have a certain hope for your children. You have a certain hope for the next generation that maybe they can have more opportunity. Again, I argue that that's an essential part of the American dream, always has been. Right? Even if you don't feel very much hope that you'll get rich or make it in a certain level, you might have more hope for the next generation, and that could keep you going. That can, bless you, very often keep you going. I would even argue that's what kept the 4 million slaves going. They knew they were never going to get out of slavery, but perhaps their children would have a better experience, right? That might be enough to get you through the day sometimes. Teacher certification programs might fit until the whole professionalization we talked about. Well, shouldn't teachers have certain tests they have to pass before they let us come before a room like this and spat off ideas? Right? What if we're insane? Right? What if we don't know what we're doing? Ultimately, that could harm you. I'm never that here, of course. But this notion of professionalization, having to pass certain tests or go to school a really, really long time to be able to do what we do, makes some sense. Just like providing a medical degree to someone and having them pass certain board exams before they cut you open makes certain sense. And they're going to push these movements as well. At the end of the 1890s, they would do things like draft campaign platforms, right? They're really going to specifically step into the arena of politics, come together as a group, and put out ideas that they think are in the common interest, in the interest of all, but particularly in their interest to maybe change certain things. Rarely early on do they run their own political candidates. Really, they start looking for candidates that are saying things they agree with. Later, they're going to take that next step. Later, they're going to say, why can't we run our own candidates? That might even challenge the establishment of the status quo. But early on, they are not perhaps ready for that as of yet. They do take strong political stands. They do maybe even begin to change the discussion of politicians that are already involved. Right? All these politicians that know now they have to address millions of farmers might say something about the importance of the farmer. They push for state ownership of the railroads. This is going to be a major step by the end of the 1890s, state ownership of the railroads. Now, some might say, wait a second, that sounds like communism. Right? The government, the state owning some aspect of the economy and regulating it and running it. Right? That might sound quite radical from a certain perspective. Right? That's kind of the opposite of capitalism in a certain sense. But is it? Maybe is it the opposite of democracy? Right? Or is it controlled by the people? They're going to start maybe raising certain questions and certain difficult questions. If the state runs the railroads, won't they provide a fairer rate for those that are feeding the nation? Right? As opposed to, say, a Vanderbilt who's really just about profit, making his pockets wealthier. Again, nothing wrong with that under capitalism. But does that help the public good? So certain folks are maybe raising certain questions earlier on. They want to lower tariffs. Remember the whole regional aspect of this tariff debate. If you're producing raw materials, you really want a low tariff. Whereas if you're producing finished goods, you may want a higher tariff that protects those goods. And so there's still regional aspects to this as well. Some question the money itself, the financial system itself. So they start doing things like pushing for coming off the gold standard and moving towards silver as a financial backing for the economy. Right? So this notion of silver is going to really take hold by the early 1890s and much more later. You're going to see candidates run particularly on silver. By the 1890s, these alliances would control the Nebraska legislature. So they actually gain a political foothold in certain areas, certain states, like Nebraska. And they're powerful in other Midwest legislatures like Minnesota, South Dakota, some other places. Not in the big cities as of yet, but they are making their presence known. And in many cases, they're really angry at the railroads. Right? Some of their first targets are railroads and those that run them in a way that they feel is unfair to the little guy, particularly to farmers. Railroads would become specific targets of strikes and other collective action. So if you think about farmers, particularly in the South, focusing on kind of big business, and workers in the North, like in Chicago, Haymarket, these other places, focusing on big business and unionizing, you're getting a national movement at this point. Right? You're getting people, common people, who by themselves have very little voice. But when they come together, right, when they form an imagined community of workers or farmers or everyday people, suddenly they seem to have a lot more power and they're recognizing their strength. The Great Uprising of 1877 is a good example of how these things might spread. Great Uprising of 1877. Now, if you think, that's a while back, right at the end of Reconstruction, we talked about several weeks ago. Right? Great Uprising of 1877 is generally considered the first nationwide strike. First nationwide strike. It begins in West Virginia. It's going to spread all the way to New York City. But this is not just about a small town or even a smaller state or even just about farmers. It's going to be a larger movement It's going to spread to New York City, Buffalo, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a lot of these big industrial cities of the time, Kansas City, all the way out west to San Francisco. Workers are going to say, well, these workers are striking, we should strike along with them in order to try to exercise a strength and change something. Right? They target something and change something. In those cities, workers would form angry crowds, which is scary to a lot of the folks in charge of these societies to see, say, several thousand workers outside with signs and chanting angrily in these things. They start doing things like stopping trains, hop in front of a train and say this train isn't going anywhere today, literally bringing the trains to a halt. You can imagine how those in charge of the railroad industry have to take notice of that. They literally would stop trains. Sometimes they seize food supplies. Think if you're a farmer and you're producing all this stuff, you're selling at a rate that you can't feed your own family. It doesn't seem like it makes sense that farmers might be starving. Yet there are farmers that are literally starving, and then they start questioning, why is that the case? How does that make any sense? So you have people seizing food supplies, workers seizing food supplies off of trains and liberating them, right? Giving them back to the people that they felt truly earned them. The authorities would have to respond to this, of course, right? This seems like anarchy. This seems like unrest. And so there's going to be a response. But the rioting would persist for over a week. This is a major event. Fearing a national insurrection, imagine what just happened. This is 10 years after the end of the Civil War. So fearing another, essentially almost civil war, President Hayes, who we mentioned before, comes in 1876, used the army to crush the strike in Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, federal troops actually fire into the crowd. 20 people are killed. So some people think this is Civil War Part 2. Now it's not just North-South. Now maybe it's workers and those that own the means production. Maybe it's workers challenging politicians, which could be even scarier on some level. Think about how many workers there are in different parts of the country, North, South, and West. Memories of the uprising of 1877 would scare business and government officials for a long time. They would have sort of memories of this. It actually prompted the creation of the National Guard. The National Guard is going to be created in response to this notion of putting down urban unrest. Right? And the construction of armories, particularly these armories in working class areas. If you still look at where most National Guard centers are and armories are, they're called working class areas, right? The fear was not from an outside force at that moment. The fear was internal. What if these workers decide, you know what, we're no longer invested in this society? So it's interesting to think about some of the lingering effects of this. Women would help build the labor movement, even though they're often not allowed to join unions. Right? They would help fuel these labor and agrarian or farming protests. Women are going to play prominent roles as much as possible, even while they campaign for their own rights. So they're going to take a kind of dual-edged sword and maybe fight for workers' rights on one hand, but also women's suffrage perhaps on another hand. And again, when you find yourself in a movement, you start questioning everything. Right? So if you're a woman, for example, yes, so workers deserve this and that, you might start thinking, wait a second, we as women deserve certain things too. And maybe once you let that cat out of the bag, it's difficult to put it back in. Yes?
I know, like, for most, like, uprisings or, like, political movements or protests, like how they do, there were instances of, like, how it got out of hand or, like, spiraled, or you said, like, 20 people got shot. Or if it was, like, an immigrant protest, there might be, like, a racial, like, riot or something like that. Were there any instances of, like, how women were fighting for their rights where, like, a women's protest got out of hand? Or, like, they got attacked by some non-pro-women?
Yeah. You know what immediately comes to my mind when you ask that question is women's suffrage, which picks up beginning in this period, but really in the 1890s and early 1900s. Some women are going to be attacked and killed because they are protesting for the right to vote. Some of them in very unladylike ways. Men are freaking out. They're like, wait a second, this is really questioning everything, right? Why do you need to vote? I'm the head of the household. You're essentially trying to undermine me as a male, as the head of household. And so a lot of men, a lot of these ladies' husbands, in fact, are hostile to that movement. but also politicians and others, especially when they begin protesting publicly, making speeches and things, which still wasn't considered very ladylike. Sometimes when they, quote unquote, had abandoned their ladiness or ladyhood, or however you want to phrase it, then some say that opens them up to certain criticism. Some women are going to die around this. And some of them would willingly give their lives for it. There's a famous, I think it's 1913 in England, a woman suffragist. They're at a horse race. Horse race is one of the big sports there, and the king is there at this horse race. There's a woman suffragette that sneaks onto the track, steps under the rail as the horses are coming around, steps in front of the king's horse, and gets run over and is killed. She protests this in order to demonstrate her extreme belief that women should have the right to vote, to impact royalty literally in the stands, to show the lengths that women are willing to go to gain their equal rights. So yeah, I mean, literally folks are going to die over trying to change their society in ways that they think is just and fair. And there's tremendous fear. I think this notion of fear is really important to understand on both sides. Those without power fear those with power, and those with power fear those that don't have it. They feel like suddenly they're going to be losing something. It's interesting in a society when people feel like they're losing something, the extremes that they're willing to go to stop that from happening. Later on it may seem silly, but at the time it seemed, like the end of the world to a lot of these folks. So yeah, that question is definitely right. You would think that women would have some protection, this whole notions of true womanhood and protection and whatnot, but that's not always the case, and especially not for all women, especially working women. Upper class women might be have an additional level of protection, but working women often did not. These women are active in the Knights of Labor. Right? They're active in the unions that would allow them to participate. In particular, they would focus on things like equal pay, which is interesting. Right? 100 years later, more than that, we're still focusing around questions of equal pay and other ideas. Now remember, the AFL has a different vision. The American Federation of Labor had a different vision of unionization. They put forth the family wage, right? This idea that the husband, if he was just paid enough, then women wouldn't have to work. Right? Whereas the Knights of Labor, some might see them as much more radical, and women within them as much more radical, as push and say, these women are saying, look, pay us all equally, and then we don't have to depend on a husband. Right? We can sort of be independent in our own right. The Knights had perhaps 65,000 members at its peak, and it did things like run daycare centers, which again might free up women to work outside of the home. They did things like start cooperative kitchens, which again is going to impact women who are seen as primarily responsible for preparing food. Might free them up to do other things as well. In fact, the Grangers took this gender question seriously and would only issue a charter to new branches when they had a certain percentage or a certain level of female participation. These Grangers said, look, we have to include women. We have to include half the population if this movement is going to gain any traction. So it's interesting that they sort of make that recognition early on. In both the Northern and Southern alliances, women made up at least 25% of the membership. And some might hold leadership positions as well. Right? Some might hold leadership positions. Perhaps this is good training again for the sort of coming next wave of feminism that we're going to see explode, especially the 1890s, early 1900s, leading to things like women's suffrage in 1920. Frances Willard, for example, is going to be one of these leaders who eventually is going to be the leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, progressive organization from the 1870s to the 1890s that was trying to stop drinking, right, trying to stop the problem of drunkenness. She's one of the most famous women of the 19th century, in fact. In 1890, this is sort of a tipping point for these organizations. The 1890, the Farmers Alliance would meet to push for a national third-party system. They start to say, you know what, maybe the Democrats and the Republicans don't serve our needs. Maybe we need another party, our own party, to literally challenge the status quo. This is a risky proposition, as we know. Third-party candidates still don't do well in this country. In 1892, 1,300 representatives from farmers' alliances, the Knights, the Colored Farmers Alliance, all would meet in St. Louis. So in 1892, thousands of them would meet in St. Louis and form the new People's Party. The People's Party. Literally a political party that they think can challenge the two major parties. So 1892 is an important tipping point. Think about the country once again in 1892. This is the highest year of lynchings, 230. So there are racial issues, obviously. You got all these workers that have been making noise here for at least 15 years, and now they form their own political party. There's tremendous tension in the society around things like workers' rights, class, race, gender. All of these things are kind of swirling at the same time. The People's Party would call for things like government ownership of the railroads, once again. They essentially should be turned over to government to run them more efficiently, effectively, and fairly. They also called for government ownership of banks, that the financial system should be completely in the hands of government. Telegraph lines. These sort of national institutions, these things that serve the national population, they argue should be controlled by government. They push for a graduated income tax, or pay more based on your salary. 8-hour workday seems radical for the time. Right? Now we consider it pretty standard. They also push for the restriction of immigration and other things. Right? So even as they're very radical on some levels, they also might be seen as conservative on others. Right? If they, for example, if they feel like they can stop immigration, then this enhances their position as workers, since most immigrants coming over are going to be looking for jobs. Right? They feel like they're a threat in terms of their employment. So it's interesting how one might be very radical on one end and might still be conservative on some others if you feel like it's in your interest. So this People's Party, or populists as they start to be called, quickly become a political force. They quickly are making their voices heard. They win certain things locally, but they also impact the major parties. The major parties have to take them into consideration. And it's interesting how these major parties would respond. For example, the Democrats, in order to hold on to their voters, remember the Democrats are particularly powerful in the South, where the populists are very powerful or growing in stature, but also among workers in the North. So the Democrats, in order to hold on to their voters, would adopt many populist platforms. And ultimately, the Democrats would adopt populist candidates. They say, why don't you come over here and run with us? So it's interesting that first they start listening to them, maybe just a little bit. Then they say, that's a good idea. And they implement some of their ideas in their own platforms. And eventually, they're even going to poach some of their candidates. Yet in 1892, the populists would win a number of local victories. You do have populist candidates winning and gaining in strength in 1892. And they looked optimistically 2 years ahead to sort of congressional elections of 1894. They're thinking, look, if we did well in 1892, we'll be even more of a force 2 years later in 1894 and maybe 1896 with the elections happening in that year. Again, a lot of this has to do also with what's happening in the country. The context of the nation is constantly changing, and there's tension and turmoil, particularly in the 1890s, the sort of crisis of the 1890s. Economic depressions. There are severe economic depressions that affect the confidence of all Americans in the 1890s. That suddenly, perhaps, maybe the economy is not always going to grow. Maybe capitalism isn't the only way to think ahead. Maybe these populists and others have something to contribute. Nothing is more challenging, perhaps, than this economic depression that lasts for 5 years. 5 years or so of trouble. The railroads that had, helped foster all this economic growth in the late 19th century also brings about depression. So one of the things that's helping the nation gain economic strength might also be what's undermining the national economy as well. For example, the collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad. Collapse of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and others would fuel a stock market crash and the panic of various banks. It starts a kind of chain reaction of panic and collapse. Again, we're going to see with the Great Depression, something similar happens once the banks panic and people start losing their money and their life savings. So, things are really in trouble at that point. In a few months, more than 300 banks failed. 300 banks failed or came close to failing, and nearly 200 railroads and 15,000 businesses go bankrupt. So this is really a horrible time economically. It's impacting various sectors of the population. In many cities, unemployment reaches 25%. So 1 in 4 people lose their jobs, right? 1, 2, 3 unemployed, 1, 2, 3 unemployed. That's going to have a ripple effect. You're unemployed, you can't pay for your house, you can't feed your family, right? You're not buying any of the products that are being produced. So this ultimately is going to hurt even more people than that 25% or 3 million nationwide. It's not going to be until after 1900 really that things are going to return to normal. So this is kind of the backdrop for all of this challenging the society, is that there is a problem. Vagrancy laws that we talked about under Reconstruction, implemented in particularly to control the freedmen, might also be used to jail unemployed workers. Thousands, in fact, can be jailed under these vagrancy laws and will be jailed. Several strikes are going to occur, like the Coeur d'Alene miners, the Homestead Steel Workers in 1892, right, the Pullman workers. Workers are going to use the one thing they have, their labor. They're going to withdraw their labor. Right? That's what a strike is. You're refusing to work. You're refusing to produce until your demands are met. The Pullmans work on the trains, so there's a direct attack on the railroad there. Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs is one of these important figures. He would take up the Pullman strikers' cause, and President Cleveland would send federal troops to Chicago to disperse the strikers. Once again, you have the president intervening, saying, look, workers, this is illegal what you're doing. You can't do this. You essentially have to do your job. Right, so President Cleveland sends federal troops to Chicago to break up these strikers. Many are killed or injured, and Eugene V. Debs would be arrested for his support of this movement. Debs would say, look, we can't continue this way. Eugene Debs really was seen as very radical for the time. He says that labor could not succeed under the present system, that the system itself has to be fundamentally changed. Bless you. Eugene Debs was a supporter of Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. Right? So he had read this book, was very impacted by it. We talked about last time. He goes to jail. He goes to jail for his activism. And he would emerge from jail committed to the ideas of socialism. This idea of sort of everybody sharing equally, government regulating the economy in order to spare these sorts of downturns. Committed to socialism, he comes out, and in 1898 he would help form a political party espousing this ideology. Debs is interesting. He's actually going to run for president at one point and get millions of voters to support him. So this is really a growing idea. Think about the ideas that are characterizing the society. Many of them we've already discussed. The social gospel, right? A growing number of Protestant and Catholic clergy noticed and publicly commented on the contradictions between kind of the ideals of Christianity and religion on one hand, right, the theory, and the attitudes that are directed at the poor in this period. They say, wait a second, how can we call ourselves religious folks? And Christians in particular, this notion of Jesus Christ and his teaching, yet we look down on the poor. Is that what Jesus did? So many of them say, no, it's not. That there needs to be a fundamental change. The social gospel can bring about much of this. Many felt like they cannot sanction an economic system that allowed long hours, unhealthy conditions, dangerous conditions. And they demanded that the church should be at the forefront in leading these reform efforts. Right? The church should actually try to change the society, not stay separate from it, behind the church walls. Right? This whole idea of the social gospel spilling out into the streets. Right? They called for an end to things like child labor. Right? Maybe you shouldn't have 8-year-olds working in a steel mill. Again, it seems common sense to us now. At the time, maybe not so much, right? But they say, look, this is one of the things that needs to change. They begin to support labor and its right to organize, collectively bargain, child labor, laborers. Leaders like Washington Gladden, who was a prominent member of the social gospel, write books kind of putting these these ideas out there, right, spreading the social gospel. And women are also very prominent in the social gospel movement. Think about, again, the WCTU, Women's Christian Temperance Union, we mentioned before. They're going to try to stop drinking. They see drinking as a fundamental problem in the system and in the society, and particularly for women and children. You got these husbands that get drunk, come home, and abuse their wives, abuse their children, or get drunk and get fired, and then the whole family is going to be thrown out. So the WCTU specifically targets temperance as an idea, cutting down drinking tremendously, drinking and drunkenness as a social problem. Again, taking kind of Christian doctrine out of the church and taking it and applying it. The YWCA, Young Women's Christian Association, right? YMCA, Young Men's Christian Association. These could be seen very much as a kind of social gospel. They have Christian in the name, but they're really in the society itself. The election of 1896, and again, think what's happening in 1896 from the other directions we've looked at it, right? Plessy versus Ferguson passes, law of the land. But there's also a presidential election, and this is seen as kind of a referendum on a lot of what's happening in this period. Right? The election of 1896 is seen as a referendum on economic issues, not just racial issues, but economic issues, and particularly economic reform. How much change should be allowed? How much change should be pushed? Right, with Republicans, Democrats, and populists all advocating certain types of changes. So everybody is kind of grabbed onto change as the theme. The Democrats stole much of the populist party's thunder. The Democrats, in some ways, are smart politically based on some of the things they're doing here. What they did was nominate William Jennings Bryan. They nominate William Jennings Bryan. So both parties essentially nominate the same guy. William Jennings Bryan is nominated by both the populists and the Democrats. Yet even the very popular William Jennings Bryan can't overcome the Republican candidate, William McKinley, and his control of the cities. Right? Once again, we're seeing how strong the cities are politically with so many people moving there. It does raise this issue of silver versus gold currency. Right? Populists would be advocates of silver. Jennings Bryan was a major advocate for silver replacing gold currency. But they lose. Right? Ultimately, this loss is going to signal maybe people's disillusionment with populism, with these ideas. Right? They maybe had their run, but they weren't able to kind of take it all the way. Voter participation would start to drop in this period. Maybe a lot of people are still disillusioned. Right? Voter population has dropped from its high of 80% to much lower. We'll see what it is in these upcoming elections. McKinley's victory is seen as the end of kind of popular change, by many at least, to the nation's governing system. So again, all this stuff is happening at the same time. We talked about some of the racial stuff in the South, and now North and West. You're thinking about politics and workers and women and all these sorts of things. In some ways, we can kind of flash back to the age of segregation and thinking about how race may impact a lot of these things as well. I remember the development of de jure and de facto laws are well established by this point. Many of them are seen as normative, both in the North and in the South, or South and in the North. You had Jim Crow laws in the North as well. It wasn't just a Southern thing. Essentially, this notion of racial supremacy or white supremacy is in place, carried out by various things we've talked about: literacy tests, poll taxes, vagrancy laws, grandfather clauses, property qualifications, all these sorts of mechanisms that we're familiar with. There were a number of civil rights cases that overturned even some of the aspects of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments that we talked about. 1883, for example, that case would overturn the previous Civil Rights Act of 1875. Talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896. Separate but equal is the law of the land. Nationally, not just locally. The number of lynchings that explodes, 1892 being the high point with 230. Again, even some politicians that had been friendlier to African Americans in this period, including some populist leaders. Tom Watson is a good example of this. Tom Watson is really a really good example. Even some politicians that had worked with blacks would turn on them for political purposes. Once they feel like it's no longer in their interest, they would turn against them. So these Southern Farmers Alliances and Colored Farmers Alliances that start to work together a bit, you're going to see race once again creep up. Tom Watson, for example, after accepting a fusion ticket, as it was called, preaching ownership of the railroads and banks and political equality for both races. This is very radical. Tom Watson is seen as very radical in favor of racial equality and things in the early 1890s. But after they lose in 1896, after Plessy versus Ferguson becomes the law of the land, and retiring from public life, Watson is going to change his tune quite a bit. He's going to change his viewpoint, perhaps. He would return after 1900 preaching white supremacy. So he goes from preaching racial equality in the 1890s, retires from public life, and comes back and is preaching separatism and white supremacy.
Do we know why? Or like what happened?
I don't know. I think in part it might just be political expediency, right? It's one thing to preach something when it sounds like a good idea, but if you feel like you can't win, we don't know if he really believed it or not. Sometimes it's hard to tell with politicians if they really believe what they're saying. He might think, you know what, I still have a plan for benefiting everybody, but I have to get elected in order to implement it. And I can't get elected in this society preaching racial equality. Who knows? It's a good question, though, to go from that extreme. I mean, he could have just been moderate from the beginning. Right? He was really radical in terms of preaching cooperation, racial cooperation. But something has changed in the 6-7 years, from 1890 to 1896 to after 2000. The last part of this is America as an empire. The United States is becoming an empire at the same time it's having all these internal issues, right? So this notion of imperialism or colonialism as a question, should the United States become an empire, right? Should we have colonies? Some say no, we used to be a colony. Right? We fought for our independence, and why now should we take on other colonies? Others say yes, we should take on other colonies because we have something to contribute. We have something to give them. I remember American exceptionalism. There's something exceptional about us as this idea. Shouldn't we then spread democracy and capitalism and Christianity and all these good things? So there's really a strong debate developing in this period. Many Americans thought the economic crisis was based in part on the fact that we don't have enough markets. So if we have colonies, we'll have millions more new people to buy all these products we're making. Right? This could ultimately help our economy. That's kind of the basis of colonialism, help the mother country. Right? So this changes some people's view on whether the United States should become an empire or not. So maybe it's not just the collapse of railroads. Maybe it's not having enough markets. They thought that perhaps the economic system had expanded to its limit. Maybe we've kind of reached its limit. As we reach the, manifest destiny in the West Coast and all that, maybe we need to think beyond the Pacific, beyond the Atlantic. While the number of millionaires grew from 100 millionaires in 1860 to 4,000 millionaires in 1892. That seems like a good thing on one level, right? The number of extremely wealthy folks increases tremendously in that 30-year period, 1860 to 1892. Most working people lacked enough income to buy the very things they produced. So you're working in a factory in automobiles, you can't afford to buy the car. That seems like a fundamental contradiction to you if you are a worker. So a lot of folks say, look, there's some problems here. We need to address them. Maybe expansion can help us expand the economy as well. So physical expansion might help. Some people also argue from a kind of racial perspective that imperialism or colonialism might be a good thing. This kind of notion of the white man's burden. The white supremacy is tied into this notion of colonizing other lands and ultimately helping them, pulling them up in the way that we pulled ourselves up. Now, of course, that ignores that folks didn't necessarily ask you to come pull them up, but this is a very powerful notion, and the idea comes from Rudyard Kipling's poem, right, The White Man's Bird. But it's really this notion of thinking economically, thinking racially, and other factors that might go into pushing the United States towards becoming an empire. Do Americans have a responsibility to civilize and Christianize, quote-unquote, others? This is the question that folks are asking. As we know, missionary activity has a much longer history, and there have been both good and bad missionaries, perhaps abroad, but some folks are going to tie it into this imperial effort, and it actually increases in this period. Not just based on any one particular denomination, right? But and denominational activities do increase, like the YMCA, YWCA, and others. But just the larger idea of spreading this sort of gift to others could take a number of forms. Business and political leaders look abroad, right, for opportunities. Again, this might help the economy. Between 1870 and 1900, exports would more than triple. We start sending three times as many exports abroad, from 400 million to over 1.5 billion. Right, so we start exporting much more abroad. And the U.S. had long had an interest in nearby lands, right? We can go back into our colonial history and look at our interest in Canada, for example. Part of what almost happens in our conflicts with Britain, as folks argue for taking Canada, taking Mexico, parts of Latin America. We negotiated the purchase of Alaska in 1867. I considered trying to annex Canada in 1867 after it became a self-governing dominion. It doesn't happen, but it is an idea. Great Britain really refuses to kind of give it up. We probably didn't want to go to war with them again, so it didn't happen. The good neighbor policy is part of what comes out of this. Didn't write that up here. Good neighbor policy. It's coined by Henry Clay in the 19th century, this good neighbor policy, but it really indicates a desire to dominate the markets of our southern neighbors. That we'll be a good neighbor, we'll involve ourselves in their economy, and that will keep Europe out of kind of our backyard. It leads to various treaties with Mexico, Colombia, the British West Indies, other areas close to us, fairly close to us, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, would allow the U.S. to dominate local economies. So it's going to have a wide-ranging impact, these ideas. In the 1880s, Congress would appropriate funds to build up U.S. naval power. If we're going to be a great power, we have to have a Navy that can protect these overseas investments. And the annexation of Hawaii may fit into this as well. On July 1898, following nearly a century of kind of economic penetration, in 1887, a treaty allowed the U.S. to build a naval base at Pearl Harbor. Obviously, this is going to be important later in our history, World War II, when Pearl Harbor is attacked. The next year, American planters arranged the overthrow of the Hawaiian king. And when Queen Lilia Koalani, I always jack her name up, when she tries to take political control back, the U.S. minister, prompted by an economic magnate, a pineapple magnate, Sanford Dole, the Dole pineapples, called for military assistance. So there really is the economy and kind of military working together in this sense. U.S. sailors would land in Hawaii in 1893. The Queen would be deposed, and a new government would be installed, proclaiming it an American protectorate. It's protected and partly controlled by the U.S. Couple that with the Spanish-American War, and you sort of get the idea, right? Especially how domestic affairs are fueling things internationally. Although there are going to be some that argue against this, or anti-imperialist leagues and other things that develop in this period. All right, so that sort of ties everything up from this period. I know it's a lot of information. Be thinking big picture again about how this stuff all fits together, the big ideas, social Darwinism, social gospel, those sorts